She showed up with a small gift in her hands, and a heart full of silent hope. No one had invited her. No one was expecting her. But she came anyway, because deep down, she believed that a mother never really needs an invitation to her own daughter's wedding. What happened next could have been just a moment of awkwardness, but it became something much deeper, something that would unravel years of secrets, lies, and quiet sacrifices no one ever saw. And when the truth finally came out, it left everyone speechless. This is not just a story about family. It's a story about shame, silence, and the unbearable cost of being forgotten. Stay with us. Watch until the very last second. You won't believe where this ends. And if you're with us, don't forget to like, follow the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the McAllister farm as Janet Matthews clutched the flower-wrapped package against her chest. Her weathered fingers had worked through 3 sleepless nights to finish the dress inside, every stitch a prayer, every seam a memory of the little girl who once ran barefoot through their tiny backyard garden. She hadn't received an invitation to her own daughter's wedding. The news had reached her the way painful truths often do, accidentally, cruelly, through someone else's careless words. Mrs. Henderson from next door had been talking loud enough on her porch phone for the whole neighborhood to hear. "Oh, honey, it's going to be quite the affair. Victoria's marrying that banker boy, Evan Hargrove. They've rented the entire McAllister property, hired some fancy French caterer from Atlanta. Can you believe it? Little Victoria from the trailer park all grown up and fancy now." Janet had gripped her coffee mug so tight that morning she was surprised it didn't shatter. But here she stood, 3 days later, in her best Sunday blouse, the pale blue one she'd ironed twice. Her graying hair pulled back in the same simple bun she'd worn to every PTA meeting, every school play, every graduation Victoria had ever had. Her black shoes were scuffed but polished, bought from the clearance rack at Payless 5 years ago but still presentable. The McAllister farm stretched before her like something from a Southern Living magazine. White silk tents billowed in the gentle Georgia breeze, their edges trimmed with magnolia blossoms and baby's breath. Crystal glasses caught the sunlight on elegantly draped tables, and a string quartet played softly near the rose garden. Guests moved like beautiful butterflies in their designer dresses and tailored suits, their laughter tinkling like wind chimes. Janet felt like a shadow among the light. She'd walked the 2 miles from the bus stop, her gift growing heavier with each step, not because of its weight. The dress inside was delicate as a whisper, but because of everything it represented. All the nights she'd stayed up sewing other people's dresses to pay for Victoria's piano lessons. All the time she'd eaten peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so Victoria could have the school lunch money. All the dreams she'd wrapped around her daughter like a protective blanket, never asking for anything in return, except to be part of her life. The moment Victoria spotted her from across the lawn, Janet knew she'd made a mistake in coming. Her daughter's face, radiant just seconds before as she posed for photographs, crumpled into something between panic and shame. Victoria excused herself from the photographer and hurried over, her elaborate white gown rustling against the manicured grass. Up close, Janet could see the expertly applied makeup, the professional styling, the diamonds at her throat that probably cost more than Janet made in 6 months. "Mom," Victoria whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder at the guests. "What are you... how did you... I made you something," Janet said simply, extending the package. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "For your special day." Victoria's eyes darted around the elegant gathering. A group of older women in pearls and pastels were already looking their way, their expressions curious. Mrs. Hargrove, Evan's mother, was approaching with that particular smile wealthy women wore when they encountered something they didn't quite understand. "Mom, listen," Victoria said quickly, her voice barely audible above the string quartet. "The thing is, well, these people, they don't really know about our situation, about where I came from." She paused, and Janet felt something cold settle in her stomach. "There's a little table set up in the back garden. Maybe you'd be more comfortable eating there, away from all the commotion." The words hit Janet like a physical blow, but she'd spent 48 years perfecting the art of swallowing pain. She looked at her daughter, this beautiful, polished woman she'd raised with calloused hands and an overflowing heart, and simply nodded. "Of course, sweetheart. Whatever makes you happy." Victoria's relief was palpable and heartbreaking. "Thank you, Mom. You understand, right? It's just, today is so important in Evan's family. I understand, Janet repeated, though she wasn't sure she did. Not really. The back garden was where the catering staff took their smoke breaks. A small folding table had been set up near the tool shed, with a single plastic chair and a paper plate covered with a cloth napkin. Someone had thoughtfully included a plastic fork and a can of Coca-Cola, still cold, which was something. Janet sat alone as the sounds of celebration drifted over the hedge. She could hear the clinking of real glasses, the murmur of sophisticated conversation, the occasional burst of laughter. She ate the chicken that had gone slightly cold, and the green beans that were perfectly seasoned, and she tried not to think about all the birthday parties where she'd been the only parent who showed up, all the nights she'd helped Victoria with homework at their tiny kitchen table, all the times she'd held her daughter through nightmares and heartbreaks and growing pains. When she finished eating, she carefully placed her gift on the paper plate. The package looked small and humble next to the towering display of wedding presents visible through the French doors of the main house, crystal vases and silver serving sets and other things that belonged in the kind of life Victoria was stepping into. Inside the flower-printed wrapping paper was a dress Janet had been working on for months. It was made from fabric she'd bought with money saved from skipping meals, sewn during the hours after her regular alterations work was done. The dress was the color of spring leaves with tiny hand-embroidered flowers along the hem, flowers that matched the ones in their old garden, the one where Victoria used to make mud pies and catch fireflies and beg for just 5 more minutes before bedtime. But it was what Janet had sewn into the hidden pocket of the dress that would change everything. Tucked carefully into the lining, where only someone who really looked would find it, was a small envelope. Inside that envelope was a photograph and a letter written in Janet's careful handwriting. The photograph was old, creased from years of handling, and showed 3 people: a young woman holding a newborn baby, an older woman standing beside them, and a man in an expensive suit whose face was carefully torn away. The letter began, "My dearest Victoria, there are things you need to know about where you really came from, and why I could never let you go." But Janet kept that secret to herself as she walked back through the shadows toward the road. Behind her, the celebration continued. Music and laughter and joy that didn't include her. She'd given her daughter everything she could, including the space to be ashamed of her. But someday, when Victoria was ready, the truth would be waiting in that hidden pocket, sewn with love and careful stitches into a dress that might never be worn. As Janet reached the main road, she turned back once to look at the golden light spilling from the wedding tent. Somewhere in that glow was the little girl she'd raised, the woman she'd sacrificed everything for, the daughter who'd just asked her to eat alone in the shadows so no one would know they were connected. Janet pulled her thin cardigan tighter against the evening chill and began the long walk home, carrying with her a weight that had nothing to do with the empty gift box in her hands. The secret she'd protected for 25 years was finally ready to come out, but first Victoria would have to decide if she was brave enough to look for it. The gravel road stretched endlessly before Janet as she made her way home, the sounds of Victoria's wedding fading into whispers carried by the warm Georgia wind. Her feet ached in the old black shoes, but she welcomed the pain. It was easier to focus on than the hollow feeling that had taken residence in her chest. Behind her, the McAllister farm glowed like something from a fairy tale. The string quartet had given way to a jazz band, and she could hear the distant sound of dancing, of celebration, of a life moving forward without her. Every step took her further from the daughter she'd raised and closer to the small house that held all their shared memories. The trailer park where they'd lived during Victoria's childhood had been torn down 5 years ago, replaced by a strip mall with a Subway and a Dollar General. But Janet had managed to buy the little craftsman house on Maple Street. Nothing fancy, but it had a front porch with a swing and a backyard big enough for a vegetable garden. It was the first place she'd ever owned, purchased with money saved from 20 years of hemming wedding dresses for other people's daughters. Inside, the house felt impossibly quiet. Janet set her purse on the kitchen counter and walked to her sewing room, the converted back bedroom where her Singer machine sat surrounded by bolts of fabric and spools of thread organized by color. This was her sanctuary, the place where she'd built their life one stitch at a time. She pulled out her old composition notebook, the one with the marbled cover that she'd kept hidden in the bottom drawer for years. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it to a fresh page and began to write. "Tonight I watched my daughter get married, and she was ashamed of me. I sat alone in a back garden while strangers celebrated the life I helped build. But I need to write this down, because someday she might want to know the truth about where she came from, and I might not be here to tell her. The pen felt heavy in her fingers as memories flooded back. She wrote about the night 25 years ago when 18-year-old Melissa Patterson had shown up at her door during a thunderstorm, 8 months pregnant and terrified. Melissa had been the daughter of the wealthiest family in town, and the man who'd gotten her pregnant was already married with a political career to protect. Janet had been working as a seamstress then too, living in a tiny apartment above the dry cleaner. She'd taken Melissa in without question, held her hand through labor and watched her cry as she signed papers that didn't exist in any official capacity, papers that said Janet Matthews would raise this baby as her own, and that Melissa Patterson would disappear from their lives forever. The arrangement had been simple. Melissa's father would pay for the baby's expenses until she turned 18, and in return, no one would ever know that his daughter had given birth to a child out of wedlock. There would be no adoption agency, no legal paperwork, no trail that could ever lead back to their family name. But what they hadn't counted on was Janet falling completely, desperately in love with the tiny girl who'd been placed in her arms. She'd named her Victoria because it felt like a triumph, this perfect, beautiful child who'd chosen her to be a mother. And for 25 years she'd kept the secret, even as Victoria grew up asking questions about her father, even as she invented stories about a tragic love affair to explain why they were alone. Now, as jazz music drifted through her open window from the distant wedding, Janet pulled out the old shoebox she kept on the top shelf of her closet. Inside were things Victoria had never seen: hospital bracelets from the night she was born, the original birth certificate with baby Patterson written in fading ink, and photographs of Melissa holding her newborn daughter with tears streaming down her young face. At the bottom of the box was a small velvet jewelry case, navy blue and worn soft with age. Janet hadn't opened it in 15 years, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the beginning of the end of their carefully constructed life. Inside the case was a diamond ring, not large by today's standards, but real and beautiful. It had belonged to Melissa's grandmother, and she'd pressed it into Janet's hand the night she'd left. "For Victoria," she'd whispered, "when she's old enough to understand that love sometimes means letting go." Janet held the ring up to the lamplight, watching it catch and scatter tiny rainbows across her sewing room walls. Tomorrow she would have to decide whether to continue protecting the secret that had shaped their entire relationship, or to finally tell Victoria the truth about the woman who'd given birth to her and the sacrifice that had brought them together. The phone rang suddenly, startling her from her thoughts. The caller ID showed the number for Regional Medical Center. "Mrs. Matthews, this is Sarah Chen from Patient Services. I know it's late, but we've had a situation come up regarding some old records. There's been a request to review adoption documentation from 1999, and your name came up as a potential witness. Would you be available to come in tomorrow morning?" Janet's heart hammered against her ribs. After 25 years of silence, someone was asking questions. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think it's time." As she hung up the phone, Janet looked at the half-finished letter in her notebook, at the ring still glinting in her palm, at all the evidence of a secret that had defined her entire adult life. Somewhere across town, Victoria was dancing with her new husband, surrounded by people who thought they knew her story. But the real story was here, in a small house on Maple Street, waiting for someone brave enough to claim it. Victoria Hargrove stood in the marble foyer of her new home, still wearing her wedding dress, though the reception had ended hours ago. The Hargrove family estate on Peachtree Hills stretched before her like a museum, all polished surfaces and inherited antiques that whispered of old Southern money and careful breeding. Everything was perfect, pristine, and felt absolutely nothing like home. Evan emerged from his study, loosening his bow tie with the practiced ease of someone who'd worn formal wear since childhood. At 32, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from never having to wonder where his next meal would come from, never having to choose between electricity and groceries, never having to explain why his mother worked with her hands. "Hell of a party," he said, pouring himself 2 fingers of bourbon from the crystal decanter on the sideboard. "Though I have to ask, who was that woman in the back garden? The one you were talking to?" Victoria's stomach clenched. She'd hoped he hadn't noticed that in the chaos of greeting 200 guests and posing for endless photographs, her moment of panic had gone unobserved. "Just someone from the old neighborhood," she said carefully, stepping out of her designer heels. "You know how people are. They hear about a wedding and suddenly everyone wants to crash the party." Evan studied her face in the way that made her feel simultaneously loved and examined. He'd graduated summa cum laude from Emory Law, and those analytical skills that made him such a successful attorney sometimes made her feel like a witness under cross-examination. She seemed to know you pretty well, called you by name. He took a sip of bourbon, his gray eyes never leaving her face. Actually looked quite a bit like you, now that I think about it. People always say that about Southern women. Victoria laughed, but it sounded forced even to her own ears. We all start looking the same after a while. Must be something in the sweet tea. She escaped to the bedroom before he could ask more questions, but she could feel his gaze following her up the curved staircase. The master suite was larger than the entire trailer where she'd grown up, with a walk-in closet that could have housed a small family, and windows that overlooked manicured gardens that had never known the chaos of a child's imagination. The wedding gifts were arranged on the antique writing desk like an altar to their new life together. Waterford crystal, Wedgwood china, silver serving pieces that would require a staff to maintain properly. And there, incongruous among the luxury, was her mother's humble package, still wrapped in its cheerful floral paper. Victoria had carried it upstairs, meaning to open it, but now she couldn't bring herself to touch it. Instead, she shoved it deep into the back of her walk-in closet, behind the designer clothes that still had tags attached, and tried to pretend it didn't exist. Meanwhile, across town in his medical practice, Dr. Evan Hargrove was discovering that his new wife had more secrets than he'd realized. His last patient of the day was Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald, an 80-year-old widow who'd been coming to him for arthritis treatments for the past 2 years. "I saw the wedding announcement in the paper," Mrs. Fitzgerald said as Evan examined her swollen knuckles. "Such a beautiful bride. You're lucky to have found Victoria." "Thank you, Mrs. Fitzgerald. I certainly think so. You know, I recognized her immediately from the photograph. She looks just like her mother did at that age." The elderly woman smiled warmly. "Janet Matthews is a saint, that woman is. Raised that girl all by herself, worked her fingers to the bone to give Victoria every opportunity." Evan's hand stilled on Mrs. Fitzgerald's wrist. "I'm sorry, did you say Janet Matthews?" "Oh yes, dear. The seamstress over on Maple Street. Been doing alterations for half the women in this town for 20 years. Sweet as pie, never asked for anything from anybody. Though I always wondered about Victoria's father. Janet never talked about him. Not once in all the years I knew her." That evening, Evan sat in his study with a glass of bourbon he couldn't taste, staring at the wedding photo on his desk. Victoria's smile was radiant, perfect, but now he could see something else in her eyes, something that looked suspiciously like fear. The woman in the back garden hadn't been a party crasher. She'd been Victoria's mother, and his wife had been so ashamed of her that she'd made her eat alone like some kind of servant. 20 miles away, Janet Matthews was sitting in her small kitchen, staring at a manila envelope that had been slipped under her door while she was at the hospital that morning. Inside were legal documents requesting her testimony in a case involving fraudulent identity claims and adoption irregularities dating back 25 years. Someone had started asking questions about Victoria's birth, and Janet had a terrible feeling she knew who was behind it. She opened her composition notebook and continued writing the letter she'd started the night before. "The truth is harder than any lie we've ever told, sweetheart. But lies have a way of unraveling, especially when they're built on shame instead of love. Your real mother never stopped thinking about you, and the man who helped create you has spent 25 years making sure no one would ever find out. But secrets have a way of demanding their due, and I'm afraid our time is running out." Outside her window, a storm was gathering over the Georgia hills, and Janet couldn't shake the feeling that it was heading straight for all of them. The guilt ate at Victoria like acid for 3 days after her wedding. She'd tried to lose herself in the routine of newlywed life, arranging furniture in their palatial home, writing thank you notes for crystal bowls she'd never use, pretending that the wrapped package in her closet didn't exist. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw her mother's face in that moment of quiet acceptance, the way Janet had simply nodded when asked to eat alone in the shadows of someone else's celebration. On Thursday morning, while Evan was at the hospital, Victoria finally found the courage to retrieve the package from its hiding place. Her hands shook as she carried it downstairs to the sun-drenched sitting room, where morning light streamed through windows that cost more than most people's cars. The floral wrapping paper fell away to reveal a dress that took her breath away. It was the color of new spring leaves, made from fabric so soft it felt like a whisper against her fingers. Every seam was perfect, every detail crafted with the kind of care that only came from love. Along the hem, tiny flowers had been embroidered by hand, daisies and violets and forget-me-nots that looked exactly like the ones that used to grow wild behind their old trailer. Victoria pressed the dress to her face and was instantly transported back 20 years. She could smell her mother's perfume, white shoulders from the drugstore applied sparingly because it had to last, and feel the safety of being small enough to hide in Janet's lap during thunderstorms. She remembered summer evenings when they'd sit on their tiny porch, Janet's fingers never idle, always mending or hemming or creating something beautiful from scraps, while Victoria caught fireflies in mason jars. "Oh, Mama," she whispered, and the tears came like a dam bursting. As she held the dress up to examine Janet's exquisite handiwork, her fingers found something unusual in the construction. There was a hidden pocket sewn into the lining, so carefully concealed that only someone who really understood sewing would notice it. Inside, she found an envelope that had been aged soft with handling. The photograph inside made her world tilt sideways. It showed a young woman who looked startlingly like Victoria herself, holding a newborn baby with tears streaming down her face. Standing beside them was a younger version of Janet, her arm around the girl's shoulders in a gesture of comfort. But it was the third figure that made Victoria's blood run cold. A man in an expensive suit whose face had been carefully torn away, leaving only his torso visible. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in fading ink, "Melissa, Victoria, and J.M., August 15, 1999, the day everything changed." With trembling fingers, Victoria unfolded the letter that had been wrapped around the photograph. The handwriting was Janet's careful script, but the words seemed to come from a stranger. "My dearest Victoria, if you're reading this, then you've finally found the courage to look past the surface of things, the way I always hoped you would. There are truths I've protected you from your entire life, but you're a grown woman now, married and starting your own family, and you deserve to know where you really came from. Your name at birth was Victoria Patterson. Your mother was Melissa Patterson, the daughter of Judge Robert Patterson and his wife Eleanor. She was 18 years old, a freshman at the University of Georgia, when she became pregnant by a man who was already married, a man whose political career would have been destroyed if the truth had come out. Melissa's father paid me to take you, to raise you as my own, and to never speak of where you came from. But what he didn't understand was that the moment I held you in my arms, you became mine in every way that mattered. I didn't raise you for money, sweetheart. I raised you for love. Your birth mother wanted to keep you, but her family convinced her that giving you up was the only way to protect everyone involved. The last thing she said to me was, 'Tell her someday that I never stopped loving her, even when I had to let her go.' I know this changes everything you believed about yourself, about me, about the life we built together. But please remember that every choice I made was to protect you, to give you the chance at happiness that circumstances tried to steal from you before you were even born. The ring in the blue velvet box belongs to you. It was your maternal grandmother's. Melissa wanted you to have it when you were old enough to understand that sometimes love means sacrifice. I hope someday you can forgive me for the deception, and for not being the kind of mother you could be proud of at your own wedding. I hope you can understand that protecting you has been the greatest honor of my life. All my love." Janet Victoria read the letter 3 times before the words truly sank in. Everything she'd believed about her life was a lie. The tragic love story she'd invented about her father, the pride she'd taken in overcoming poverty through her own determination, the shame she'd felt about her humble origins, all of it built on a foundation of carefully constructed fiction. She wasn't the daughter of a seamstress who'd made mistakes. She was the daughter of one of the most prominent families in Georgia, given away to protect a scandal that could have destroyed careers and reputations. But more than that, she was the daughter of a woman who'd loved her enough to sacrifice everything, her own reputation, her chances at a different life, her claim to recognition, just to give Victoria a chance to grow up safe and loved. The woman she'd asked to eat alone in the shadows of her wedding was the only real mother she'd ever known. Victoria clutched the dress to her chest and sobbed until she had no tears left, grieving for the mother who'd given birth to her, for the woman who'd raised her, and for the daughter who'd been too ashamed to claim either of them. The phone call came at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, just as Evan was reviewing patient files before his first appointment. The voice on the other end belonged to Judge Robert Patterson, a man whose name carried weight in Georgia political circles and whose endorsement could make or break careers. "Dr. Hargrove, I hope you'll forgive the early hour, but I wanted to personally congratulate you on your recent marriage. I understand you wed Victoria Matthews." Evan paused, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. He'd never met Judge Patterson, though he certainly knew the name. "Thank you, sir. Though actually, it's Victoria Hargrove now." Of course. Beautiful ceremony, I'm told. Though I have to say, I was surprised to hear that Janet Matthews was there. Haven't seen that woman in years." The casual way Patterson said his mother-in-law's name sent a chill through Evan's chest. "You know Janet?" "Oh yes, we go way back. She did some work for my family years ago. Quite the seamstress, that one. Very discreet." There was something in the judge's tone that made Evan's legal instincts prickle. "I don't suppose Victoria mentioned our connection?" "No, sir. She didn't." "Well, no reason she would, I suppose. Ancient history and all that." Patterson paused, and Evan could hear papers shuffling in the background. "Listen, Dr. Hargrove, I'm calling because there's been some unusual activity lately. Legal inquiries about old adoption records, that sort of thing. Nothing that concerns you directly, I'm sure, but I thought you should know that your wife's family history might be getting some unwanted attention." The line went dead before Evan could ask what that meant. That afternoon, while Victoria was at a lunch with the other doctors' wives, a ritual of careful conversation and competitive charity work that she was still learning to navigate, Evan found himself driving to Maple Street. He told himself he was just being thorough, that any good husband would want to understand his wife's background. But the truth was darker. He was beginning to suspect that Victoria had built their entire relationship on lies. Janet's house was exactly what he'd expected. Small but well-maintained, with a front garden full of the kind of flowers that required more love than money to grow. When she answered the door, her face registered surprise, then something that looked like resignation. "Dr. Hargrove, I wondered when I might see you again." She invited him in for sweet tea, and they sat in her modest living room surrounded by the kind of furniture that lasted decades because it had to. Family photographs covered every surface. Pictures of Victoria at every stage of childhood, from gap-toothed elementary school portraits to high school graduation. What struck Evan was how happy they both looked in every single image, how the cramped spaces around them seemed to glow with warmth and contentment. "You want to know about the wedding?" Janet said before he could speak. It wasn't a question. "I want to know why my wife was ashamed to introduce me to her mother." Janet's laugh was bitter. "Because I'm not the kind of mother who looks good on a Christmas card, Dr. Hargrove. I'm not the kind of woman who can make donations to the hospital auxiliary or host dinner parties for your colleagues. I work with my hands. I live in a house that could fit in your foyer, and I raised that girl on love and determination instead of trust funds and connections. That's not what But you want to know why she lied to you about who I am. Why she told you I was just someone from the old neighborhood instead of the woman who bandaged every scraped knee, who stayed up all night when she had pneumonia, who worked double shifts to pay for her piano lessons." Janet's voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "The answer is simple, son. She's ashamed of where she came from, and I'm the living reminder of everything she's trying to forget." Evan set down his glass of sweet tea, the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to click into place. "Judge Patterson called me this morning. He said he knew you, that you'd done work for his family." Janet's face went pale. "What did he tell you?" "Not much, but enough to make me think there's more to Victoria's story than either of you have been telling me." For a long moment, Janet studied his face, seeming to weigh her options. Finally, she stood and walked to an old secretary desk in the corner, returning with a manila folder that looked like it had been handled many times. "Victoria's birth certificate," she said, sliding a document across the coffee table. "The real one." Evan's hands shook as he read the name at the top. Victoria Eleanor Patterson, born August 15, 1999, to Melissa Ann Patterson, and father unknown. "Judge Patterson is her grandfather," Janet said quietly. "And I'm not her mother, Dr. Hargrove. I'm just the woman who was paid to raise her when her real family decided she was an inconvenience they couldn't afford to acknowledge." The room seemed to spin around Evan as 25 years of carefully constructed lies crumbled in the space of a heartbeat. His wife wasn't the self-made woman from humble beginnings that she'd pretended to be. She was the secret daughter of one of Georgia's most powerful families, raised by a woman who'd been bought off to keep quiet about a scandal that could have destroyed careers. "Does Victoria know?" he managed to ask. Janet's smile was sad and knowing. "She does now. I left her a letter explaining everything. The question is whether she'll have the courage to face the truth, or if she'll keep running from it like she's been doing her whole life. As Evan drove home through the gathering twilight, one thought kept echoing in his mind. If Victoria could lie about something this fundamental, what else about their life together wasn't real? The Fulton County Courthouse buzzed with the kind of tension that preceded uncomfortable truths. Janet Matthews sat in the witness waiting room, her hands folded in her lap, wearing the same blue dress she'd worn to Victoria's wedding, the only formal outfit she owned. Across town, Victoria sat in her pristine kitchen, staring at a half-empty bottle of wine and the muted television that was broadcasting the morning's court proceedings live on the local news channel. The case had exploded across Georgia's media landscape like a wildfire. What had started as a routine investigation into adoption irregularities had uncovered a decades-old network of illegal baby trafficking involving some of the state's most prominent families. Judge Robert Patterson's name was splashed across every newspaper, his political career crumbling as federal investigators pieced together evidence of babies sold to protect reputations and campaigns funded by silence. But Janet hadn't been called as a defendant. She'd been called as a witness, the one person who could testify to what had really happened 25 years ago, when desperate families made deals that treated children like commodities. Mrs. Matthews, would you please state your relationship to the defendant, Judge Robert Patterson? The prosecutor was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s named Angela Rodriguez, who'd built her career on cases that gave voice to the voiceless. She'd spent 3 months tracking down Janet, following a paper trail of old hospital records and sealed documents that should have stayed buried forever. I was employed by Judge Patterson in 1999 to provide care for his daughter Melissa during her pregnancy, and subsequently to raise the child born from that pregnancy. And that child's name? Janet's voice was steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs. Victoria Eleanor Patterson, though she's known today as Victoria Hargrove. In her kitchen, Victoria's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor. On the television screen, her mother, the woman she'd asked to eat alone in a garden, was telling the world secrets that Victoria had only learned days ago. Mrs. Matthews, can you describe the circumstances under which this arrangement was made? Janet closed her eyes for a moment, remembering that terrible night when 18-year-old Melissa had arrived at her door in labor, sobbing that her father would disown her if anyone found out about the baby. Melissa Patterson was 18 years old and pregnant by a married man whose identity her family wanted to protect. Judge Patterson offered me money to take the baby and never speak of the arrangement, but I need to be clear about something. I didn't do it for the money. Then why did you agree? Because that little girl needed someone to love her, and Melissa begged me to take her rather than let her father send the baby away to strangers. Janet's voice cracked slightly. She said she'd rather know her daughter was with someone who would care for her than wonder for the rest of her life what had happened to her baby. The courtroom was silent, except for the scratch of reporters' pens and the soft whir of television cameras. This wasn't the testimony anyone had expected from a woman who was supposed to be a co-conspirator in an illegal adoption scheme. Mrs. Matthews, did Judge Patterson continue to provide financial support for Victoria after her birth? He did, until she turned 18. But I want the court to understand. I would have raised that child whether he paid me or not. Victoria became my daughter in every way that mattered the moment I held her in my arms. And what happened when Victoria reached adulthood? Janet's eyes found the camera that was broadcasting live to the local news stations. Somewhere out there, Victoria was watching, and Janet spoke directly to her. She grew into the most extraordinary young woman I've ever known. She was smart and talented and determined to make something of herself. She earned a scholarship to Emory University, graduated summa cum laude, and married a wonderful man who loves her deeply. Janet paused, tears finally spilling over. But somewhere along the way, she became ashamed of the life we'd built together. Ashamed of me. Ashamed of where she came from. Ashamed of the love that raised her. The prosecutor stepped closer. Mrs. Matthews, are you saying that Victoria was unaware of her true parentage? Until last week, yes. I protected her from the truth because I thought it would hurt her to know that her birth mother had given her away, even though it broke Melissa's heart to do it. I thought it was better for Victoria to believe she was my biological daughter than to know she was the product of a scandal that powerful people wanted to erase. And Judge Patterson? What was his role in maintaining this deception? Janet's voice hardened. He made it clear that if I ever spoke about the arrangement, if Victoria ever tried to claim her connection to his family, There would be consequences. He said it would destroy not just his career, but Victoria's future as well. He made me believe that protecting the secret was the only way to protect my daughter. As Janet finished her testimony, she looked directly into the television camera one more time. Victoria, if you're watching this, I want you to know that everything I did, every lie I told, every secret I kept, was because I love you more than my own life. You are not a mistake or a scandal or something to be ashamed of. You are the greatest gift I've ever received, and I'm proud to be your mother, whether the world knows it or not. In her kitchen, Victoria sat surrounded by broken glass and broken truths, finally understanding the depth of sacrifice that had shaped her entire life. Her mother hadn't just raised her, she'd protected her, shielded her, and taken the blame for choices that had never been hers to make. And Victoria had repaid that love by asking her to eat alone in the shadows. 3 weeks after Janet's testimony, the small town of Roswell, Georgia, was buzzing with preparations for something unprecedented, the first annual Invisible Women Awards, a ceremony created by the local women's shelter to honor mothers who'd sacrificed everything for their children, but never received recognition for their devotion. Janet had tried to decline the invitation. She'd spent 25 years living quietly, avoiding attention, making herself small so that Victoria could shine brighter. But Sarah Martinez, the shelter director, had been insistent. Mrs. Matthews, your story has given hope to hundreds of women who thought their sacrifices went unnoticed. You showed the world what real motherhood looks like, even when it costs you everything. The ceremony was held at the Roswell Community Center, a modest building that had seen countless high school graduations and church potlucks. Nothing about it resembled the elegant affair at the McAllister farm where Victoria had gotten married. But as Janet walked into the packed auditorium, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: belonging. The audience was filled with women who understood struggle, single mothers working double shifts, grandmothers raising their grandchildren, foster mothers who opened their hearts to children the world had discarded. When Janet's name was called, the standing ovation lasted 5 full minutes. I don't know what to say, Janet began, her voice shaking as she stood behind the simple podium. I never thought of myself as special or heroic. I just did what any mother would do. I loved my daughter the best way I knew how. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces that reflected her own struggles back at her. But I learned something important these past few weeks. Sometimes loving someone means letting them be ashamed of you. Sometimes it means sitting alone in the shadows so they can stand in the light. And sometimes it means telling the truth, even when that truth might hurt them. Meanwhile, across town, Victoria sat in Eleanor Hargrove's pristine living room, her mother-in-law's disapproving gaze making her feel like a defendant in her own trial. The Patterson scandal had dominated local society pages for weeks, and Eleanor had summoned Victoria for what she euphemistically called a conversation about family reputation. I have to ask, dear, Eleanor said, her voice dripping with the kind of southern sweetness that carried poison underneath. Did you know about your heritage when you married Evan? Victoria's hands shook as she set down her teacup. I found out after the wedding. I see. And this woman who raised you, this Janet Matthews, you've spoken with her since all this unpleasantness came to light? No, Victoria whispered, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. Eleanor's smile was sharp as a blade. Well, I suppose that's understandable. It must be quite shocking to discover that your entire life has been built on deception. Though, I have to wonder. She leaned forward conspiratorially. What kind of daughter allows her mother to eat alone in a garden while she celebrates with strangers? The question hit Victoria like a physical blow. Eleanor Hargrove, with her old money and careful breeding, had just delivered the most devastating judgment of all. Even she, with all her prejudices and pretensions, recognized that Victoria had committed an unforgivable act of cruelty. I think, Eleanor continued, rising from her chair with regal dignity, that you need to decide what kind of woman you want to be, Victoria. Because the woman who treated Janet Matthews like a servant at her own daughter's wedding is not someone I raised my son to marry. That evening, Victoria found herself standing on Janet's front porch for the first time in 6 months. The little house looked smaller than she remembered, but the garden was blooming with the same wild profusion of flowers that had filled her childhood with color and wonder. She didn't knock. Instead, she left something on the doorstep. The green dress Janet had made for her, carefully folded and wrapped in tissue paper. tucked inside was a note written on expensive stationery that seemed absurdly pretentious for what she needed to say. Mama, I wore your dress today. Not to a party or a dinner, but just to feel close to you. It fits perfectly, like everything you ever gave me. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I can't take back what I did at my wedding or the years I spent being ashamed of the most beautiful love I've ever known. But I need you to know that the woman who raised me, the woman who sacrificed everything so I could have everything, is the only mother I want. Evan left me yesterday. He said he couldn't be married to someone who could be so cruel to the person who loved her most. He was right to leave. I'm coming home, if you'll have me. Not to the big house with the marble floors and the crystal chandeliers, but to the place where I learned what love really means. Your daughter, Victoria. When Janet found the package the next morning, she held the dress against her chest and cried for the little girl who used to run to her with scraped knees and broken hearts, and for the woman who had finally found her way back home. But Victoria's journey toward redemption was just beginning, and the hardest conversations were still ahead. The autumn leaves were falling like golden tears across Maple Street when Victoria finally found the courage to knock on her mother's door. 6 months had passed since she'd left the dress on the porch. 6 months of living in a modest apartment downtown while the divorce proceedings ground through the courts. 6 months of learning to see herself without the mirror of other people's expectations. She looked different now. Her hair hung loose and natural around her shoulders instead of being styled into the perfect helmet that society wives wore like armor. She'd traded her designer clothes for simple dresses from Target, and her hands, once soft and manicured, now bore the calluses of someone who'd been learning to support herself through honest work. Janet opened the door wearing an apron dusted with flour, her gray hair escaping from its bun in the way Victoria remembered from childhood. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Two women who'd been shaped by love and wounded by pride and were finally ready to find their way back to each other. I brought something, Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. She held up a canvas bag containing dishes, silverware, and a tablecloth that had belonged to her grandmother. Not the Patterson grandmother she'd never known, but Janet's mother, who'd taught her to set a proper table with care and intention. I thought maybe you'd let me cook for you this time. Let me set the table and serve you dinner and treat you the way you deserve to be treated at my wedding. Janet's eyes filled with tears, but she stepped aside to let Victoria in. The little house smelled like home, like the lavender sachets Janet tucked into every drawer, like the vanilla candles she lit during thunderstorms, like the lifetime of love that had been poured into every corner. Victoria moved through the familiar space with the reverence of someone returning to a sacred place. She set the small dining table with Janet's best dishes, the ones with the tiny roses around the rim that had been a wedding gift from Janet's own mother 40 years ago. She lit candles and arranged the few late-blooming flowers from the garden in a mason jar, creating something that was simple but beautiful in the way that only comes from the heart. Tell me about the divorce, Janet said quietly as Victoria worked. It's final next week. Victoria paused in her preparations, her hand stilling on the tablecloth. Evan said he fell in love with someone who didn't exist, said he couldn't build a life with someone who could be so cruel to the person who loved her most. Was he right? Victoria's laugh was bitter. Completely right. I created this perfect version of myself, the self-made woman who'd overcome poverty through determination and hard work. And I was so committed to that lie that I erased you from my story. I erased the woman who made all of it possible. She turned to face Janet, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mama, I am so sorry. Not just for the wedding, but for all of it. For being ashamed of this house, for pretending I didn't know you when people asked about my family, for letting you think that your love wasn't enough. Janet crossed the small kitchen and wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her the way she had when Victoria was small, and the world seemed too big and frightening to navigate alone. You were trying to protect yourself, baby girl. I understand that, but you can't build a life on shame. It'll poison everything you touch. They ate dinner by candlelight, talking about everything and nothing. Victoria told Janet about her new job working as a victim's advocate at the women's shelter, how she'd realized that her experience with deception and reinvention actually helped her understand other women who were trying to escape lives that had been built on lies. Janet talked about the garden she was planning for spring, about the sewing classes she'd started teaching at the community center, about the quiet contentment she'd found in her simple life. I have something for you, Janet said as they cleared the dishes. She disappeared into her bedroom and returned with the blue velvet jewelry box Victoria remembered from the letter. Inside was the ring that had belonged to Melissa Patterson, Victoria's birth mother. It was beautiful but not ostentatious, the kind of piece that whispered of love rather than shouting about wealth. She wanted you to have this when you were old enough to understand what it meant, Janet said. It's not about the money or the family name. It's about the love she had for you even when she had to let you go. Victoria slipped the ring onto her finger, and for the first time in her life she felt connected to all the women who had shaped her story. Melissa, who had loved her enough to give her away, Janet, who had loved her enough to raise her as her own, and Eleanor Hargrove, who had loved her son enough to demand he marry someone worthy of that love. "I want to be better," Victoria whispered. "I want to be the daughter you deserve to raise, the woman who honors your sacrifice instead of hiding from it." Janet smiled and reached across the table to take her daughter's hand. "You already are, sweetheart. You already are." Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering Maple Street in a blanket of forgiveness and new beginnings. Inside the little house, two women who had been separated by pride and shame finally found their way back to the love that had always been waiting for them. Sometimes, the people we hide are the very ones who held us up when the world turned its back. What would you have done in her place? If your own child asked you to disappear into the background of the most important day of their life, would you still show up with love in your hands? Or would the pain be too heavy to carry? And what about the daughter? Have you ever been so afraid of your past that you tried to erase the very person who made your future possible? How far would you go to belong in a world that never saw your worth unless you changed your story? This was not just a story about a wedding. It was a story about wounds we don't talk about, and the quiet power of a love that never stopped. If this moved you in any way, help us spread it. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. And let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from?